Hello and welcome back to the I Am Barabbas podcast. My name is Reggie Thile, and this week in season 4, where faith meets mental health, we pick up on a new subject. We're titling it The Empty Cup, Addiction and the Search for Wholeness. So if you've ever wondered why people get addicted to things or why they have a hard time giving things up, this is the episode for you. Part 1, where we consider the biology of addiction and why it's so hard for us as human beings to give up on the things that we know we should be giving up on. And then in part 2, which will be next week, we'll look at the psychology of addiction. In part 3, we'll look at the social dimensions that contribute to addiction. And in all 3 parts, we will integrate scripture with the points that are brought out from research. And then we'll also consider the role the church plays in this very, very difficult issue to deal with. And I come from a perspective of someone who grew up in the home with an addict as a parent. And so I know that there are a lot of people who are looking for answers like, why did my mom do this? Or why did my dad do that? Why couldn't they just love me? Why couldn't they give that up so that I could be safe? There are a lot of questions that children of addicts have. And I spent my time working on my degrees and getting my education, and even in teaching and counseling, trying to get those answers. And so what I've learned is that learning about addiction itself provides the best pathway to getting that kind of knowledge that we need to be more understanding of people who have addictions, to realize that I myself am not perfect and have my own addictions, and then to also figure out how we can create communities that support people through their addictions and even past them, rather than passing them off to a system that will probably just end up with them being dead. And so here again, the focus of episode 1 is on the biology of addiction. And we start with this question: what if addiction is not primarily a moral failure, but is a hijacked longing for transcendence? In other words, what if it's more than sin, and it's actually related or linked to the desire that I think everyone can relate to be more than what we are, to look at this world and to see where we are at in it, to be struggling the way we are or just living lives the way that we are. We will naturally ask ourselves, like, what is this for? What is my purpose? What is my meaning? We will wonder about life after death. Is there one? Do we just get annihilated and that's it, it's over? Then what do I do here on earth? Like, why am I here? Am I here just to help the species get better, evolve to a place where it's functioning better, humanity is functioning better than it ever has before? Or if I believe in a life after this life here on earth, and what does that look like? And how do I get there and make sure that I'm there in like the best kind of scenario possible? And so it's, I think, again, very natural for us as human beings to look at ourselves beyond what we see on a day-to-day basis. We want to find worth and meaning. And what if then those people who struggle with addictions, and particularly to addictions that we would consider harmful, like drug addictions, certain foods are very destructive, or we could even look at addiction to pornography as well. What is it that they're looking for in that addiction? Is it just an opportunity to sin, or is it something more than that? And so the thesis statement that I developed for this entire series, not just this one episode, is this: addiction is a biopsychosocial spiritual disorder rooted in the brain's reward circuitry, shaped by trauma and environment, and ultimately reflecting a misdirected search for wholeness that only God can satisfy. And what we're going to look at in this episode is the first part of that statement: the idea that addiction is rooted in the brain's reward circuitry. So we're going to focus on how the brain's reward system works, how addiction hijacks this dopamine pathway system of pleasure, and then we're going to look at the role of stress and trauma and how neuroplasticity can give us hope for recovery, or the ability for the brain to change what's going on inside of it so that we're not always just doing what it's built to do or how it's formed to react to certain situations that we're in. And then finally, we'll also look at scripture. We'll actually look at scripture throughout the episode today, and try to have an understanding then of the truth in scripture and the truth discovered through science and, like in neurobiology, and then try to piece those things together. And for those people who like to focus on addiction being moral failure or being sin, looking at the science can be a struggle, because you can look at a person's behavior and they're an addict and you say, well, they're just being so sinful. And you start to throw biology into it. You can start to wonder, well, then were they ever doing anything wrong? They were just doing as they were designed to be. But the reality is that just because we function according to the design that God has made our bodies to work, it doesn't mean that design is always working the way He intended it to work. Sometimes the design can be out of order. It can be working in a way that is not how God wanted it to function, but it's functioning. And so we have to take steps to try to get it working the right way and to correct it. And where this helps then is not eliminating the idea that addiction is sin. It certainly leads to sinful behavior. I've seen people, I've told you, I'm a child of an addict. So I know what it's like to have an addict in the home and then to see them sin, and to not tie those two things together is irresponsible. But at the same time, to try to then solve it through just like faith, prayer, reading the Bible, going to church, that's not going to work either. You have to have an understanding of what's going on in a person's body so that you know how to treat it. And to just treat it as a moral failure is a failure itself. So what we're looking at here is neurobiology and the design for reward system that we can see in the brain. And so what's on the screen is depicted there are the neural pathways related to the pleasure circuitry or the release of dopamine. And we saw this in our series of belonging. We're looking at how connection is something that we take pleasure in. It's also something we need to survive. We don't connect with people as human beings simply from a biological perspective. How do we survive on our own? No man is an island kind of thing. And even with looking at it just from like a biological perspective, or even from those who just believe in evolution, you can see that some animals do well on their own. Like a tiger is just like that lone animal, but then you have the lion, who's the king of the jungle, can't be on its own. It can function, but it prefers and it needs to be with other lions. And so as human beings, we have this design for connection, and that design for connection is also connected to this reward circuitry for pleasure. So it feels good to make good connections, and that's part of preserving ourselves. We want that to feel good so that we continue to make good connections. So that when you look at how the brain is designed, we have this reward system, but it is not isolated. It's not static. It doesn't just work that one way with connection. It can work in other ways as well. In other words, the brain doesn't restrict what responses will be elicited for various stimuli. You can have connection lead to pleasure, but that's not the only way to get to pleasure. You can have other stimuli that comes in, it gives us pleasure, and that's the brain's way of making sure that we continue to do things that please us. The idea, the assumption is that when we do things that please us, it's also tied back to things that protect us, like being in families and having good, strong connections. But not everything that gives us pleasure is good for us. And that's where like interpretation of what it is I'm doing is important, because the brain has no way really of knowing that when you snort cocaine or you drink caffeine, or if you're, smoking marijuana or whatever else that you're doing, you're eating a lot of sugar, if that action or those actions are actually good for you. It will connect it to the feeling of pleasure, and then it will associate with pleasure those things, and then it rewards you for doing that. But the brain doesn't judge whether or not that usage is a good usage of this system. And so the brain's reward system reinforces behavior that's essential for survival and for social bonding, things like eating, connection, reproduction, exploration. And I guess it'd be awesome if our brain itself had someone at the front of these neural pathways or some kind of system that could look at what's about to enter it and say, whoa, 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 you look like you're part of the eating behavior, or you look like you're part of healthy reproductive behavior. or making connection with people, but I can tell there's something off here, you don't belong, and then send it out. And so, like, for example, if someone is overeating and eating like a lot of sugar and they have this addiction to sugar, and so they eat just a lot of candy and they're putting sugar and everything, the brain at some point would say, or would have said before they got to that point where they're putting sugar and everything, yeah, you're eating and that's good. It helps you survive. But this type of eating isn't good for you. It's going to kill you. And so it shuts off that connection and it tells you we're not going to eat that much sugar anymore. It'd be awesome if our brain could just do that automatically, but the brain doesn't do that part automatically. The brain does the other part automatically. It's up to us to take a look at what we're doing to make sure we don't allow that to happen. Now, from a theological perspective, this design I don't think is accidental. It would be nice, like I have an idea as how it could maybe improve the system, but this is the way God designed it. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 13 says that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. What I did was did a little exegesis on the word satisfaction, because like what exactly does that mean? And it's tied to a Hebrew word that is literally translated to good or goodness. It's the same word that's used in Genesis 1 when God declares that creation is good. And so it's not just mere contentment or the absence of pain, it signifies wholeness and beauty and the experience of peace, shalom. That's what we're talking about here when we talk about this satisfaction in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, that they find satisfaction, they find wholeness, beauty, and peace. And so when the teacher says that we should see good in our labor and eating and drinking, he's actually, I think, referring to the idea that that's what God made it for, to give us a sense of that satisfaction. And so he calls it a gift from God, which can be, again, a reference to the design, because then why did God design it that way? The brain to have that reward system. It's a gift that he's given us so that we can feel that sense of goodness and wholeness from doing something like eating food and having drink and being with people that we care about. It's part of, just again, the reward of being his child and his creation. So to get back to the science side of it, the reward system that God designed, it releases dopamine in response to seeing food or making connections. And because of that design, because of it releasing that, we then start to experience pleasure and satisfaction in completing the pathway. So it starts with dopamine, ends somewhere else. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And so if God wired the brain to experience pleasure, not as indulgence, but a participation of his goodness, then the tragedy is that addiction has hijacked this system and has replaced what's good with emptiness, which is the other word that the teacher in Ecclesiastes uses to describe some of the same things, but in a way where life is lived outside of the experience of having God there as well. This capacity for pleasure, I think, reflects the image of a God who also delights. And I think the reward system is part of a divine purpose to draw us towards what sustains life and deepens it in terms of a relationship with God, self, and others. And it's where we start to exclude God and exclude people, where we see that hijacking of addiction take place, where a person becomes isolated and focused on the thing alone. So I want to make sure we really understand what's going on chemically in our body. So when it comes to dopamine, it's released, as we've been saying, as a response to stimuli that we have in our environment. And what it does is it motivates us to pursue the reward. The reward is the liking of whatever it is that we're pursuing, that feeling of satisfaction, of pleasure. And that is the result of the release of endorphins in the body. And it's also called the opioid system. Now, I looked into that. It's like, why is it called the opioid system? And it actually got that name because opioids were discovered first. And then when it was understood what opioids were activating or making people feel like they're feeling good, having pleasure, then they named the system after the drug or the substance. So that's just that. But you have the release of endorphins, like serotonin, but endorphins that make us feel good. So the dopamine is released when we see the stimuli or we receive a stimuli. It doesn't have to be through sight. It can be through any one of the five senses. And that's what creates the wanting of satisfying the desire for pleasure. And then when we have the thing that we crave or we want, then the endorphins are released and we have the release of serotonin. So I did a paper on food addiction while I was working on my undergrad degree, I believe. And I remember reading about how bread itself, just eating bread, like eating carbs or whatever, kinds of the different types of carbs that are out there, the unhealthy ones, they actually lead to the direct release of serotonin, which makes us feel good. That's why we call them comfort foods, like pasta and having bread and butter or whatever it might be. But none of that is actually good for us. So if we have like a lot of pasta, a lot of bread in our lives, even if we don't realize it, we are obtaining pleasure out of that experience because it is associated with the release of serotonin or endorphins in our body. And then pretty soon, the body's going to then continue to want to have that feeling of pleasure. And so that's when certain stimuli will then remind it to release the dopamine to make you go get it. And so then you have that pairing. So what comes first, like chicken or egg? It is the endorphins, like the pleasure. When it comes to, the feeling of having the goodness. But then the dopamine is the thing that keeps that cycle going, where it creates the want, and then we need to have the satisfaction. Now, with this system in place, you function, you want something, you crave something, you'll get it. You get it, you have the pleasure, and then it may take some time before you need it again, but that's not what we experience. Okay, we want something, we get it, we have the pleasure, but then we want it again, and it's like, wow, but I just had that. Why do I want it so quickly? And so, with the science, what the research has shown here, especially the one from Barrett and Robinson 2016, the dopamine system gets hypersensitive to wanting and liking. In other words, it starts to pick up on stimuli all the time. Oh, that makes me feel stressed. Oh, that makes me feel tired. Oh, that makes me feel, sleepy or whatever it is that is being picked up on. And so in a response to that, it's like, okay, so go get some bread, go get a cookie, go get a brownie. It's just becoming overly sensitive to everything around it and making connections to wanting that release of endorphins from, the sugar, which is the addiction. But then when we have it, that system of the pleasure response to, ingesting those things, the release of the endorphins, it becomes blunted. So you don't feel as good as you felt the first time. And a lot of people understand this concept now. I've seen it on TV. It's called chasing the first high. And the reality is that it's not just about, so quote unquote addiction to drug like substances, like illegal ones like opioids that you get heroin from, or like cocaine or alcohol. It's up to a certain age illegal and then legal, but you want moderation, but you're looking for that first feeling and you never get it. It applies to anything that is outside of, what's good for us that we then overindulge in, because as we overindulge in it, the effect that we're looking for becomes blunted. The other side of it, the wanting part of the dopamine, it increases. And so it kind of works against itself in that sense. And they start to become decoupled from each other when they're supposed to be working together well. And so if any of that was just confusing, here's a simple statement to help understand what's going on. Intense craving comes back with diminished satisfaction. So the brain is screaming, get it, get it, get it. But then there's a delivery of little to no reward. And again, the brain is the thing doing all of this stuff to itself at this point. And so that's why individuals continue using despite negative consequences. They're really driven by something that's overwhelming inside of them, this overwhelming desire to go and get the pleasure they're looking for. But then when they go to get it, and then they get it and it's there, it's just not the same thing. And then again becomes a cycle of wanting more to try to get back to that place, and it's just not possible. Now, whenever I think about this material and this aspect of addiction, it does remind me of Romans chapter 7, verse 15, where Paul says, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. And so Paul is like, to me, describing that neurobiological reality of compulsion, the disconnect between intending to do something and then the action, that disconnect between wanting and liking. Like I want to do what I should do, but then I don't do that and I do what instead I hate. And anybody, anybody can just think of their own behavior in that kind of mindset can relate then I think to this idea. There are plenty of times where like all of us who are watching, I would be so surprised if there was someone who never felt this way. If I'm wrong, then prove me wrong and let me know. But I really feel like every Christian, every believer in Jesus thinks the same way where they're like, man, in the morning, I'm going to get up and I'm going to read scripture. I'm going to pray. And then I'm going to commit to doing this 3 times a day. And I'm going to commit to being a light for God. And I'm going to commit to just doing what's right. I don't want to do what's wrong anymore. And that's great. It's like a motivation. I want to do what's good. I want to live like a spiritual life. And then you wake up and you stub your toe and you drop the F bomb. And then you go to the bathroom and you're angry. And then before you know it, you're at your desk and you're drinking your third cup of coffee and you're just in this really negative place. And then you have a moment where you're like, oh God, what am I doing? I'm so sorry. Oh gosh, why did I just go into this kind of mindset, this mode? And the reality is that, again, with this system in place, oddly enough, because of the connections we've made in the past and all of the way that the reward system has worked out over our experience and lifetime as we get older, we become familiar with certain reactions to certain situations giving us pleasure. Not because they're good, but because the reward system was designed to receive those situations and then to help us continue on in them. But again, there's no regulation at the very beginning to let us know what we should be doing over and over again for pleasure and what we shouldn't be doing over and over again for pleasure. When you think about anybody's misbehavior, so whether it's an addict or not, you have to realize that in a very real sense, they are experiencing pleasure or reward for what they've done. But their pleasure reward is not the same as it used to be. And so they will continue to be sensitive to what's around them and look for more opportunities to try to get the pleasure out of that system. And so, from a very real perspective, in terms of like science, and then also from faith, so it's not just like a hypothetical thing, we have this idea that the body sometimes does get trapped into patterns of behavior that the mind says it doesn't want to do, that the heart feels bad about. But the brain, the body itself is like, well, this is what worked in the past and this is what we're going to do because it has worked. And we'll see if we can get it to work again, even if it's not. Now, that system is depicted there in that image, and the mechanism works this way. First, chronic stress elevates cortisol, which is the primary stress hormone. We talked about how this elevation leads to anxiety and depression and burnout. It also leads to addiction for the same reason. We become sensitized to all those cues that make us seek out the things that can maybe help us when we're stressed. And so elevated cortisol sensitizes the dopamine system, making it hyper responsive to potential rewards. And then the brain seeks relief through substances or behaviors that temporarily reduce stress. And this creates a feedback loop. Addiction increases stress, then increases craving, which then drives further use. And again, it's just the presence of the cortisol in the body that's leading to this pathway and this trigger system. So every time someone gets stressed, they're looking for a way to relieve that stress through the addiction. And it's, again, a pathway that's created. It's like once you start on this road, it's going to go where it's supposed to go. You can't take the highway and go somewhere else. You have to be on the road that you want to be on if you're going somewhere else. Get it? And so the pathway leads there. And so if you enter onto it, stopping that pathway, stopping the traveling along that pathway is extremely difficult. And unfortunately, you see the research there by Sinha says that people that have experienced childhood trauma show a heightened stress reactivity and increased relapse rates. So it means that people that have experienced childhood trauma, or what's also known as adverse childhood experiences, what they end up dealing with is a system that has a heightened response to just normal things that create stress. And again, that stress will lead then to that pathway where addiction becomes or can become a problem. And so with adverse childhood experiences, which can be like neglect or, household dysfunction, you can have physical, emotional abuse, domestic violence, personal substance abuse. Like I said, me being a child in a home with a parent who was an addict, then fed into my life various traumas that we can call adverse childhood experiences. And what that does is it creates this like response between childhood trauma and addiction risk. So the more someone has experienced, the more ACEs a person experiences, the higher likelihood they have of developing an addiction in the first place. And research has confirmed as well that this concept is linked across populations and cultures. We're not talking about just a, certain part of the world or one country or certain people. It's everybody. So sometimes, even from a biological perspective, we have to try to help people resolve the traumas from their past. Because without that, they're going to continue to live in a state of hypervigilance where their stress is just coursing through their body, started by, various stimuli connected to those abuses that happened when they were children. And so how does the addiction stop? You just focus on, oh, stop drinking, but you never deal with the trauma from the past, then the stop drinking thing doesn't help. They're going to continue to have that system activated in a way where it's going to create that desire and that want for that drink. And again, trying to make this relatable, think about Paul and his statement about, I do what I hate to do and I can't do what I want to do. If us as like regular people struggle to just pray every day versus, you know, saying something mean to somebody, then where can we expect people with this level of addiction to do better than us? And when I think about what the gospel actually means, what it means for us to have a Messiah and what it means to have the kingdom of God, I look at a passage like this one, Isaiah 61. He talks about, he has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and to release from darkness the prisoners. And so I see the Messiah in his ministry. I see him prioritizing healing the wounded, not just correcting their behavior. And I think that, looking at this a little further, you see what brokenhearted means. It means those who are crushed and shattered, not metaphorically sad, but someone who's fundamentally broken by trauma and oppression. And by captives and prisoners, we're talking about people who aren't just like physically incarcerated, but also people that are in like this spiritual and physical and psychological bondage. The physical part of it is that addiction part. And so you have trauma and shame and chronic stress, and it's putting people into prisons and they're bound up, and you give them the gospel and you tell them if you believe, then you'll be saved and you'll be set free, but it doesn't happen. I mean, some people it does. There may be a lot of people with that kind of a testimony, but then there are a lot of others who go through that process and then they don't find that freedom. They're still bound. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the gospel, the way it's preached, is usually focused on heaven. You're going to get saved now and you'll go to heaven. But where's the message about binding and restoring them today and setting them free today? Can't that happen today? I think it's supposed to. I've talked about this before. You talk about Jesus starting off his ministry in Luke chapter 4, and he's identifying his mission. He's there to liberate people, to restore those who are trapped in those cycles. Those, I think, are parallels to addiction. And I think the sequence matters. You bind up before you proclaim freedom. Healing precedes liberation. And I think that people try to focus on simply the liberation, like the freedom from the sin in the next world, even not even in this world. And they completely neglect the need for healing. You think about the parable of the Samaritan who helped the man who was beaten up. He himself first binds up his wounds and tends to them, and then he takes him to the inn and then gives instructions for the innkeeper to care for him there. And that's where, again, I think that part of it is missing. The idea that, when you meet people who have struggled with life, you share with them the gospel. That's great. But the healing process involves more. You have to sit with them. You have to be able to talk with them. Some of them have things that they've gone through that they need to process, and some of them have to be processed through professional kind of experience and through settings that, need and require special training. And that does not make then the gospel ineffective. No, that's part of the gospel. Knowing that someone's struggling, helping them get connected with a therapist, someone that can help them, and then seeing them go through the healing process is the gospel. Whether you preach about Jesus before or after that process, I don't know, but I think it's probably going to be more effective when it comes after the fact. Person has seen how much you've done, that you found them laying on the road, you tend to their wounds, you bring them to a place where someone can help them get better, to heal, and you come back and you visit them and make sure that all things are well, and you share that message like, wow, that person actually did something for me. And I think the better way of understanding our mission as a church. Now, our final point before we close up here is that the brain has also been proven to be plastic. In other words, it can change, it can reshape, it can reform, it's moldable. And so it can go in one direction in a negative way, and that's what creates the addiction, but can also go another way. Abstinence is probably the best way for that to happen. You detox and you become completely abstinent. It doesn't remove the craving or the reward system altogether. That can still be there. Certain cues in our environment can still trigger that. But to really kind of reshape the brain, it does help to completely cut off those substances that you have trouble with. So sometimes, my family, like my wife and I, will go through like a caffeine detox or a sugar detox. Like we'll say we're not going to have that anymore and just try to get healthy for a little bit. And that works. But unless we like completely cut those things off forever, we're going to get back to it. At the moment you're like, you've been caffeine free for 3 months and then you have coffee, that brain is going to get back to where it was. So absence really does help in that sense. Overall, you would prefer to be in a place where you can handle moderation. Of course, people prefer that. And ultimately, you have to evaluate yourself and your own behavior and say, well, if I go with moderation, am I in control? The cues come in and I say, nope, I'm not going to have that caffeine now. I know that's not good for me. I'm not going to do that. No, I'm not going to have that sugar now. It's 11 o'clock at night. That's not good for me. I've already had enough today. Can you control yourself? If you can't, then abstinence is probably the best way to go. And again, the brain can actually heal itself in that sense and fix those receptors and change those responses. But ultimately, to keep it that way, you may have to stay away from those things forever. What was also interesting in terms of this neuroplasticity is that mindfulness itself helps to increase prefrontal cortex thickness and improve executive function, which means it strengthens your ability to regulate yourself. So if you do want to try to go towards moderation, try practicing mindfulness. And then also you can focus on making sure you strengthen your healthy social connections, because there's been evidence that doing so reduces stress and craving, and it also builds resilience. So having social connection become a stronger active system for the reward of the endorphins that you're looking for. It's kind of like building a better, stronger highway that the brain is like, I don't want to go that route with that thing. I'd rather go down this route. And so if you could imagine someone being so healthy with their relationships that they have wine and it doesn't actually do anything to their brain. The brain doesn't respond to it. The brain isn't like, oh, this feels good. Let me start building a highway for a pathway to pleasure. No, the strength of the social connection is so much better. The brain kind of ignores what's going on with the alcohol and just focuses on what's going on in the room with that social connection. That's the kind of idea that's listed here. All right, so we're going to close out here with some practical applications. There actually is a lot more information I could share, but gotta keep it short. I know for time. So bear with me here as we close out with just some helpful ways to apply some of this information. The first, for individuals struggling with addiction. So if you're somebody who's watching this and you're struggling, with an addiction, the way you want to start off dealing with this is naming that addiction honestly to one safe person. You're going to somebody that you know that probably already knows what you're struggling with, but either way, isn't going to blow up on you, isn't going to judge you for what you're doing. In that sense, they're going to be like, why are you doing that? You know better. None of that stuff. Just someone who's going to listen to you and accept what you had to say and then probably respond with, how can I help? That's the kind of person you want to go to. And then you want to seek professional assessment. So if you do have kind of a substance use and issue, and this can be about food also, people don't think about it like, oh, wow, I struggle with food. I just need to work out. I need to, take Wegovy or whatever. It's not always the solution to just take a medicine or to put restrictions on yourself. Sometimes you do need to talk to somebody. They do have groups for people who overeat. They do have, therapists that work on that kind of stuff. And so go seek professional assessment and then join a recovery community. It really does help if you do it the way it's designed to be done. Now, some of them have systems of recovery in place that maybe I don't care for some of the messaging behind it, but to have a community that you can relate to is helpful. One that I have seen, it's called Celebrate Recovery, another option you can go with. Although, again, not everything to me is perfect, but ultimately you do benefit from not doing the recovery part alone. And then you want to practice some daily nervous system regulation. So remember, stress can lead to the use. And so work on breathing and meditation and mindfulness. Work on those things that I've talked about before in helping to reduce stress. Exercise is important to reduce the cortisol in your body. For loved ones, supporters, those of you who have someone in your life who is addicted, first thing you want to do is educate yourself more on this subject, especially on the neurobiology, because you want to reduce how you shame and blame the addict for what they're doing. Then you also want to set boundaries with a person without abandoning that person. You want to attend family support groups with them or whatever it is that they're doing for their recovery. If they're going down that route, you don't want to leave them to do that kind of stuff alone. And then what you're doing in all of that is offering your presence and not fixing. Now, again, I grew up with a parent who was an addict, and the trap that we fall into is the enabling, which we will talk about in the social dimensions of addiction. But enabling is a lot different from what I'm talking about here. When you talk about creating boundaries, people who enable don't have any boundaries. When you set boundaries, you're letting an addict know that what they're doing is not okay, and that when they do it, you're going to respond a certain way, going to communicate to them that the relationship has its limits. There's limits to what you can accept and be okay with. And that's where you have boundaries come into play. And usually, if the social connections are good and healthy, the desire for that is going to eventually win out. Now, with my dad, it didn't work out that way. We ended up having to completely separate ourselves from him for our own safety. But that's just an extreme case of enabling leading to that situation because we never really did set boundaries until it's probably too late. Now, for church leaders and communities, you want to preach on addiction. I would say make sure that you approach it as this complete, comprehensive issue. It's biological, psychological, social, and a spiritual issue, surely, not just some kind of moral failure. If you can't do that, then just don't talk about it. Leave it up to professionals or someone who's better qualified to handle it. What you could also do is create a recovery ministry yourself. Like with me, like I don't like some of the messaging that's out there. There's nothing that will stop you from creating a ministry within your church that is equipped with trained facilitators. So it's not just something you're doing, but it's with people that have training that can then move forward with helping people through the recovery process. So get more involved in that process then, not just judging it or people looking at it, but actually being actively involved in it. And then make sure always to provide resources for families that are affected by the addiction and foster in the church or in the community a culture of grace, not guilt, of acceptance, not shame, of belonging. And that way, when you have these problems arise, people don't feel like they're isolated from everybody and they can't go to anybody for help. And I want to add this on for the families that have the addict there and they might need help. When we were growing up, like there were times where we needed food, we needed, rides to church. We had some people we could depend on. That was great. I still know them and feel very strongly about, about them in a positive way because of those commitments and those ways that they helped us back then. But then there were other times where we didn't get the help we needed until it was almost too late. And then there are other times we didn't get it at all. And so be on the lookout for their needs. And people in those situations are used to the shame and keeping things to themselves. And so make sure you have like a regular contact with them to ask, hey, what do you need? And think about things like school. Like, do they have to go to a library? They have to do research. What is it they need to do to get their lives in order? Because everything becomes disrupted, especially when an addict is in the middle of everything they're going through and they're using. It just really brings a lot of darkness into that family's life. And so that's, I think, one of the best ways that community leaders and church leaders, pastors can help in these kinds of situations. And so in conclusion, remember, addiction is not a moral failure. It's, I think, a hijacked longing for transcendence. The brain's reward system is designed for connection and joy, and it becomes captive to substances and behaviors that promise relief but deliver bondage. Yet, neuroplasticity offers hope. And then also knowing that that's created, designed by God, gives me even more hope that the brain can change and pathways can be rewired and that healing is possible. And remember this with the gospel: the same God who knit us together in our mother's womb, it's Psalm 139, is also the same God who can restore what addiction has broken. Recovery isn't just abstinence, it's restoration. And we can all play a role in the restoration of people back into that image of God that we were originally created for. And then we are saved too for good works, and how Jesus fulfills all the things we need to get to that place and get that done. And just for like a final reflection, when you think about this, what would it look like for a church to become a community where the addicted find not judgment, but healing? They don't find shame, but they find sanctuary. Now, thank you again for watching. The next part, we will be looking at the psychology of addiction. And until then, may the grace of God be with you, and God bless.